This is what you want. This is what you get. This is what you get.
You have located GeekFest Rants, the entertainment podcast for genre geeks like you.
Shall we play a game?
Covering the world of vintage and current film and television since 2010.
Game over, man. It's game over.
Featuring in-depth conversations on sci-fi, horror, fantasy, comics, toys, and conventions.
So say we all. So say we all.
And now sit back, relax, and enjoy today's show.
19 states have seceded.
The United States Army ramps up activity.
The White House issued warnings to the Western forces as well as the Florida Alliance.
The three-term president assures the uprising will be dealt with swiftly.
Let me know if you want to try anything on.
I guess aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America.
We just try to stay out. With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
Citizens of America.
The so-called Western forces of Texas and California
Have suffered a very great defeat at the hands of the United States military.
Mr. President, do you regret the use of airstrikes against American citizens?
We're moving to D.C. today.
We need to go down there.
They shoot journalists on sight in the Capitol. Every instinct in me says this is death. Bloody.
Every time I survived a war zone, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this. But here we are.
There's some kind of misunderstanding here. Look, we're American, okay?
Okay. What kind of American are you? You don't know?
The Western forces will reach the White House on July 4th.
Oh my God.
Get in the car! Get in the car!
Move, move, move!
We're gonna hang back.
I'm not hanging back.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. God bless America.
Hi, everybody, and welcome once again to GeekFest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and today we are returning to a topic that we've only done twice before, and that is movies to watch before the election. This is the show that I warn everybody for the previous two times that we've done it, that if you do not want to hear politics, if you don't want to hear my particular politics, tune away. Do not listen to this one, because this is the one where we open it up for political connections and political themes, really, in movies that, not necessarily current movies, but older movies that kind of resonate today. I'll give you guys the list of all those movies later in the show that I've done in the past. A lot of them are still so relevant because we're still in the same theme, really, if you think about it, that we were 2 elections ago. So let's get started with our movies to watch before the election.
What did I teach you?
You fought the Duke of New York. You're a number one.
You will not laugh. You will not cry. You will learn by the numbers. I will teach you.
Can you dig it?
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
That spawn of Satan.
Oh, really?
The Force will be with you, always.
Today's first film, and again, this is your last chance to turn off the show if you don't want to hear. And I mentioned many times also, if this is how you find out what my politics are, and you can't handle it, that's fine. Find other shows that you like. But this is the one that we are going to go all. So for our first film, we are going to go to 1970, a film named Joe. This is a movie that I was completely not on my radar for a very, very long time. But then little by little, started to kind of creep in to the point where it's like, all right, let's watch this thing. And it's an older film. It's got a very 70s. It was done in 1970. And remember, when you have movies that are in the kind of borderline, between decades, because the films were done usually a year or two earlier, the style and the look of it still kind of harkens back to that decade. So again, even though this is a 1970 film, it does feel like a 60s kind of thing. But general story here, the film starts Peter Boyle. If you guys remember Peter Boyle from, oh my goodness, he's been in so much stuff. Everybody Loves Raymond. He's the grandfather. He was Frankenstein in Young Frankenstein. He was in Taxi Driver. He was in a million films. Definitely a working actor. And here, I mean, again, the older you are, the more used to you might be to seeing him in some slightly darker roles, kind of playing the heavy, more or less. But with Everybody Loves Raymond lasting for as long as it did, it totally softened up his image as far as, an actor, what kind of light comedic character he gave us, during I guess you'd call the second half of his career, the latter half of his career. But here, wow, he is as dark can get. So the story basically is about this executive who is having problems with his daughter, who is dating this hippie, and she's into drugs and drinking and this and that. And he wants to intervene and get her away from this guy that she's seeing. And in the process, he kills the boyfriend, if you will. So he gets her away, but he needs to figure out a way of, how do you get away with this? Plus, obviously the guilt involved in the killing that takes place. And that's when he meets at a bar a guy named Joe. Now, Joe is your stereotypical right-wing conspiracy theory, hate everybody, the world owes me something, everything is somebody else's fault kind of guy. I could not help laugh almost at what was happening. The movie is kind of a drama. I mean, it's a heavy drama, but it's also slightly a black comedy too at the same time, I think, because there's such contradictory events taking place and the things that these guys do in order to get away with this crime, and how Compton, which is the executive, gets intertwined with Joe's life, that they live two completely different lives, two completely different economic spectrums, and how they kind of unite in order to get through this crime that has been committed. To me, the story is pretty, I don't want to say basic, but it's a story that's pretty common in terms of how do you get away with this murder and the consequences that come because of the murder and the consequences that come because of getting involved with certain people. That's the story. That's how the story is pushed through the entire film. But to me, the standout is the character Joe. I mean, that's the name of the film. That's the lead of the film in a way, even though he doesn't come into the film until a little bit later in the film. But that character is such a repetitive character that I've seen in person, on television, on the news, you name it. And you could watch, if you've watched interviews at Trump rallies, and some of the supporters are there to talk to the media, as much as they don't like talking to the media, but you can hear it's Joe's words are all over whatever talking points that they've been given indirectly, because obviously the news is what feeds them their talking points. They just kind of parrot them out. And when you hear Joe sitting at the bar, in the corner there, watching the TV, drinking and muttering all these things, it's incredible. One of the things that I read here that they said that, and I make the same connection. It's like, in a way, it's almost like a pre-Archie Bunker. Imagine Archie Bunker, extra racist and extra dark. That is that character. you could kind of see how somebody might have seen this character say, well, you know what? If we can kind of lighten him up a little bit, he will appeal to both, which is one of the things that happened with the Archie Bunker show. And I mentioned this before. Some people I know who are very right-wingy love Archie Bunker. And I think Norman Lear has said in interviews that the appeal of Archie Bunker is something that appealed to both sides because they both saw what they wanted to see in Archie Bunker. There's no way in hell that you can kind of avoid the fact that Archie Bunker is a mockery of a right-winger. They're making fun of a right-winger. But from the right-wing perspective, he's kind of like a hero. He's the guy that identifies with him. And that's one of the things that apparently happened with this film was that there were people watching this film who were kind of cheering on the character of Joe and all the crazy stuff that he says and does. And that's something that apparently that turned off Peter Boyle for a while, that kind of like had him trying to make less violent or less dark films, even though he did obviously, return to making whatever films had to be. I mean, Taxi Driver, for crying out loud, doesn't get darker than Taxi Driver, but different, at least his character. But it's rather amazing to see how people gravitate to certain characters that are not meant to be heroic. It's a little bit like horror films where people are cheering for the franchise bad guy. And it's like, well, that's not the point of this unless you turn it into a franchise and you need the bad guy to continue to do the bad things in order for more movies to come out. In this particular case, it doesn't need a franchise. This movie, apparently they tried at certain points to possibly make a sequel where Peter Boyle is in jail for a long time and then comes out and tried to kind of change his ways, but things are not really going the way he wants them to go. But that never materialized. They never made that film. But it is, again, amazing how people will focus on certain things and claim that as their own and completely change the purpose of what it was supposed to be. It happens all over the place. It happens with franchises, with genre all over the place. You look at Star Wars, you look at Star Trek. There are right-wingers out there that can somehow identify with it, but they kind of switch the roles. The good guys become the bad guys become the good guys are projected into the bad characters. It's bizarre how, when you go back to, but wait a minute, this character was supposed to signify or stand for this. And you try to have that argument and they're like, nah, I don't think so. So this is a good one to start with. Again, it's a very strong film. Susan Sarandon plays the daughter in this film, young Susan Sarandon. So give it a shot. Again, the connection to the election, wow, that rhymes, is, to me, as far as I'm concerned, is the character. That character, that type of individual who feels that the world has, done everything against them and that nothing is their fault and all the others are responsible for his state or his status in society or in life. That kind of mentality has been around for a long, long time. And what's happened within the last couple of years or 10 years or whatever, little by little, it's been building up, is that it's turned into a mutated political party that runs on that. They run on conspiracy theories and hate and fear and blame the other for anything and everything. And it is more of a religion. It's a cult, a religion, facts don't matter kind of thing. But with this movie, you see that prototypical individual that we are kind of dealing with nowadays, all the way back in the 70s, back in 1970 or late 60s, that post hippie culture, counterculture movement, the backlash to that, the right-wing backlash to that kind of 60s movement. For our second film, I want to look at a movie called The Zone of Interest. This came out a little over a year ago, 2023, and this is one that I did not see in the theater. I mean, I was aware of it, but it was kind of very specific. It was a foreign film, very specific in terms of its subject matter. But what's really, really special about this film is how it could apply to some of the psychology that goes on even today and that could be going on in the near future if things completely go off the rails. This is a movie about a commander of the SS in World War II, Rudolf Höss. and he is in charge of Auschwitz, one of the most notorious concentration camps during the war. But it doesn't really focus on what's happening in the camp. It focuses mainly on what's happening on the other side of the camp, over the wall where he lives with his family. And the movie shows you how not so much his internal dealing and compartmentalizing of his way of thinking. It's more of how everybody is trying to live their most normal lives possible under the circumstances. But obviously, not everybody is dealing with it in the same way. He's raising a family. I think he's got like 2 or 3 kids or something like that. And he's doing family things with them. And the kids can't really tell the difference of what's going on. Now, as his wife is like gardening in their backyard, right over the wall, you have, the screams and all the sounds of what's going on in these death camps. Now, obviously, she's an adult. She understands what's happening, but she's trying to kind of put a good spin on it. And she even has her own set of friends who are like-minded and are dealing with it in the same way. And they show you how every now and then, all of a sudden, the husband shows up with a whole bunch of gifts and things that they kind of give away to each other. And these are basically the belongings of the people that are being murdered on the other side of the wall, like fur coats and gold and jewelry and stuff like that. So it really gives you an insight into how people can live their lives and completely not think about what is happening. You never see a discussion of good versus bad. It's a total denial way of living of what's going on around them. So the connection, obviously, that you get here is how people can do that, how people can just deny what's in front of them, which brings us to, obviously, the situation we have, during this election and the last 8 years, is that because the right-wing support of what Trump is doing is beyond politics now. It's really religion now. It's religion. It's cultish. You deny logic. You deny truth. You deny everything. And you just go on faith. Faith that is blind faith. Completely blind faith. I know that you could say there's a difference between religion and cults, but it's really kind of the same thing as far as I'm concerned. You're being told these are your truths, and we don't have to prove these truths. And when somebody shows you how your truths are not really logical and factual, you can just deny their facts and say, nope, I'm going with my truth, and my truth is the best. Is that whole alternative facts thing that was created around the time Trump came into office. In this film, you get to see, again, the progression of as the war goes on, the different problems that are associated with what's happening. Basically, the grandmother of the group at one point leaves because things are just too wacky going on. They have gardeners that are obviously prisoners that are being brought in every now and then to help out, and how they behave like prisoners, and people kind of dance around that whole thing and just kind of try to ignore it, which is amazing. And you really don't see a change in most of the characters while things are good, let's say. Like I said before, the mother-in-law at one point leaves because she understands what's happening and she can't seem to take it in terms of the pretending and your husband is so popular and he's so successful in his job as a camp commander, and in his recognition of his work, they give him like a promotion and they're going to send him, they ship him off closer to Berlin to do some reconfiguring of what's happening, and they're going to send him a whole bunch of new prisoners to get rid of. And he gives his wife a call, let him know he's coming back, but that while he was at this party with all these dignitaries from the SS, that he was just thinking of different ways of killing all of them. And at one point, he, kind of moves into one of the hallways and starts vomiting, which is an interesting reaction that he seems to be having. And that is that even though he can keep his mind focused on his job and he has no emotional regrets or empathy or anything like that, his body is kind of attacking him. His body is having a reaction to his work by him saying that he would love to kill everybody around him, all his commanders and all his superiors and all his everybody. And the fact that he's vomiting, to me, it seems like a sign that, again, his body is reacting to the horrible things he's doing, even though he's doing them anyway, and he's following the orders. And he doesn't seem to be having any on-screen remorse or doubt or anything like that. He's just going along. And at one point, the movie takes a weird jump cut into the present where a whole bunch of janitors are cleaning the Auschwitz Museum. And then it bounces back to him again, kind of like leaving the party, going down the stairs into this darkened area, which I guess it's supposed to be like, yep, his body's trying to tell him something. His mind is trying to tell him something. He's ignoring it, and he's going right down to the muck that he's helped to create. Very powerful film. Very, very powerful film. Like I said earlier, it's a way of examining that whole, how do you live your life denying everything around you? How do you shut off the insanity to keep your mind working into whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's your job, your interactions with people, your interaction with your family, your everyday routines and chores, and pretend that what's happening around you is just, no, it's fine, it's okay, it's normal, it's true, it's truth, everything else is fake, everything else is false, everything around me is true, when things are not. Again, a very different type of movie. The fact that you never see any of the atrocities that are happening beyond that wall. The fact that you, as an individual, you force yourself not to see it. How did the family structure works that way? How do the children, because they're children, they're not exposed to it, so they can kind of live a normal life, even though their tools and their things and their surroundings are coming off of a slaughterhouse. But as you become older, especially the adults in the film, they are really messed up people that are inadvertently, without their knowledge, I guess. I mean, it's not without their knowledge, it's with their knowledge, but they are trying to plow through this. You get to see the effect that it has on them and their relationships with some other people. Very, very powerful film. I think it was nominated for a couple of Academy Awards here and there. But yeah, it's a doozy. This one's a tough gut punch of how bad things can get when you just ignore the facts and everything happening around you. Our next film is actually a documentary called Nazi Town, USA, which is a very provocative title, if you will. And I kind of ran into this, I think it was on Facebook or somewhere, where it was like, what the hell is that all about? This is a PBS documentary about how back in the 30s, there used to be these youth camps, like summer camps for kids. And the particular theme of these camps were Nazi indoctrination. Now, these days it would seem completely insane that this would exist, but back in the 30s, there was a pretty loud, you could call anti-war, pro-Germany contingency in the country that infiltrated many, many parts of the government. Money was being funneled in from Germany into trying to get the U.S. to stay out of the war, to portray the Nazi regime as friendly to the U.S. and peaceful. And part of that included funding these different camps. Now, this particular documentary deals with a series of camps that all kind of fall under the German-American Bund, which is a pro-Nazi organization, again, formed by U.S. citizens of German descent. And they had camps in Long Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, you name it. They had these camps, and the kids would go there, and the pictures that still exists and the film that still exists that you'll see on this documentary has these kids from all different kinds of ages, from early school children all the way to teenagers, marching around in Nazi youth uniforms with swastikas and lightning bolts and certain color shirts and marching, parade type of marching, and all kinds of crazy stuff. A lot like a Boy Scout type of retreat, except completely covered with the typical anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda. Now, what's amazing about this documentary is the fact that this existed basically under everybody's nose. It was right there. I mean, granted, yes, they're out in the woods. And what's incredible is that I was reading an article about how as little as 8 years ago, they had just finally stopped one of these locations that were still German-American originated and locations where these things took place, still owned by people from back then, that they finally stopped them from discriminating, from not allowing non-Germans to own property in that area. It's amazing how these things somehow kind of creep in and stay under the radar for so long. It's kind of like, I remember a friend of mine told me a story how they were purchasing a home in Jersey, and I don't know, they did a title search or a survey or something where they were looking at the history of the house to make sure everything was right. And one of the items on the history of that property included some kind of clause as to not to sell to Jews. And it's like, wow. And that's still there. That's still on the record. Obviously, it doesn't fly anymore, but it's incredible how these things remain. And I always say that is one of the biggest differences between the North and the South. The North racism tries to be hidden, stays behind closed doors. You got to do some digging to find it there. In the South, it's out and proud. They're out and proud, and it's part of the culture, and it's part of their identification. That's how they identify their version of the racist, white supremacist, that sort of thing. I'm not saying everybody is that way. I'm just saying those who are very proud of their racism, as opposed to up north. Now, this is a documentary that is available on the PBS website. You can probably watch it on your computer. You might even be able to download it or watch it on an app, on the PBS app on your television. But it's just a fascinating documentary in terms of how you do the long term, the long con. How do you initiate? How do you indoctrinate children into this whole thing? And I do remember that there were places I visited when I lived up in New York and New Jersey where there were these communities, and it was like, okay, that's really interesting, but okay, there was a little strange vibe about the place that it was like, okay, that's weird. But it just seems completely unbelievable that this was existing right around the time of the war. Now, granted, once the war started, and especially with the results of the war, all that kind of went away, or it went away and it kind of went underground. There's a book called Prequel by Rachel Maddow from MSNBC that I read that chronicles the entire American Nazi movement that unbelievably was taking place at the same time as the war was starting to brew, and how it had infiltrated such top levels of government, senators, representatives, you name it, mayors, councilmen, all types of people doing all kinds of crazy things, how the FBI at the time and some other services were investigating them and how they would be thwarted, and the few successes they had. But hadn't it been for the full-out war and the full-out commitment of the U.S. to enter the war, and obviously the results of the war, I would not have been surprised if they would have succeeded in some of these things. Granted, their goal at the time was to just get the U.S. to look at Germany on a friendly, positive side. They just wanted them to stay out of the war. That was their entire goal, because obviously with the U.S. entering the war, it's pretty much the tide got turned after the British were getting pounded and the Russians were getting pounded. But then opening up not so much another front, but another big ally coming in, with reinforcements and supplies and everything, boots on the ground, that kind of thing. That's what kind of changed things. And they understood that would be very difficult for their war effort effort to have the U.S. enter the war. But in the meantime, you just couldn't think about it. And the other thing about this group, and again, this goes back to the German-American Bund. This is the same group that you might have seen some footage from the 30s of a Madison Square Garden rally that was taking place, where it was a full-blown Nazi parade gathering. You know, I'm talking uniforms, flags, you name it. It's all in black and white. Obviously, it's an old footage. And they'd had this big, gigantic presentation and having their own Nazi rally. It was amazing that these things were happening here in the U.S. and in New York, out of all places, which again brings us back to this particular election and these particular times where it's like so many people say, well, this isn't, you can never do that here. That would never happen. Nobody would allow a president to go that far into the fascism and Nazism. But listen, we've had a taste of it. It was tried. It failed, but it tried, and they tried pretty hard. This time around, they're still trying. They're still trying different motivations, but the same playbook. It is the playbook. It is the tools of the strongman, the fascist, the dictator. It's those tools that are being used to push a certain agenda. There's certain things that the party agrees to just in order to get alliances and get the votes of other people. The whole religious right bend to it, I'm still convinced it's not real. It's just a convenient alliance. You align yourself with religious fanatics, religious extremists, just because you want their vote. You throw them a bone. Their bone is abortion rights. Being able to let women control their own bodies, that is something that they're willing to sacrifice in order to get the vote of that particular voting bloc. Just like now, we're getting close to the end of the election. We're getting close to the actual election day, and we see the type of people that are being courted. Interviews with Glenn Beck, interviews with Joe Rogan. They're trying to grab the last little bit of morsels of extreme right-wingy QAnon nutjob type of people instead of trying to court the undecided, the center, the independents. No, they're going to the way, way right, to the last rock they can uncover and see what crawls out of in order to get those votes. And ironically enough, in the same place where they did held that famous Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, Trump is about to do another one of those. He's going to do again, this is in a state that he knows he's not going to win, but it is symbolic. And I believe it's like the same amount of people, the same number. You know, they like to play with numbers because the QAnon people love all that coincidental numbering mumbo jumbo. But they're having to, they're going to do a big rally there, kind of signifying or celebrating that kind of event. But if you ever say to yourself, this could never happen here, watch this documentary. It will give you an insight that it was like, I couldn't believe it. I'm like, are you kidding me? This has to be Europe, somewhere in Europe, some camp in Europe, in the Alps or something. I don't know. No, this was right here, right in our own backyards. But amazing documentary. Our next film is Civil War by Alex Garland. This film came out earlier this year, and it raised a few eyebrows in terms of what could this be about, how accurate it would portray what is happening politically in this country, which was also a little bit of a shocker, or part of the criticism of the film is that it does not go into detail, or it does not compare exactly what is happening to what they're showing you. And by that I mean, the film is essentially a war correspondent film. It's about a series of war correspondents. Kristen Dunst, Wagner Moura, Kaylee Spaney, Stephen McKinley Henderson, and Nick Offerman, out of all people in the world, plays the president. What the story tells you is basically, I kept referring to it as a road trip film, which is funny because that is the code name, or the working title was Road Trip. And it's basically 4 war correspondents traveling from New York to Washington, D.C. to perform an interview with the president. Now, you got to understand, this is a film where you jump into this film already knowing that there is some kind of civil war taking place. In this particular situation, you have the Western forces, which consists of California and Texas, marching eastward towards Washington. And you also have a Florida faction, the Florida Alliance, I think they called it, that is also marching kind of north towards Washington. And how these three different, even though we really only see one, I think, of those two opposing forces at play, are interacting. Now, we are not given exactly the details of what the reason for the Civil War is. All you have to know is that you're in it, which is done completely on purpose. The filmmaker, Alex Garland, didn't want to so-called pick sides overtly. However, as you watch the movie and as you get you little breadcrumbs of information, you can kind of make those connections. You can kind of say, all right, this is imitating this person. So, for example, Nick Offerman, who went on the record saying that he's not playing Trump as the president. You can kind of tell from the opening of the film when he's practicing his lines and he is stretching the truth beyond what it is, and he is making things even more grandiose in terms of the way that he's crafting his speech and the way he's exaggerating everything. You can tell this is exactly who he is imitating, for that particular scene. Throughout the movie, as they travel and they start to encounter all these different groups that are in the middle of battles. I mean, first there's like a suicide bomber taking place in New York. So you have that to deal with, where the citizens are being rationed, I think, water or something like that. And then somebody blows up the whole area. And that's kind of how a lot of these journalists get together, is as a result of that event. And then as they move towards Washington, D.C., all these different fighting groups, all these different scenarios. There's one scenario where they're kind of following a group that's in a firefight with another group near a building. Then they encounter another group. There's just two snipers shooting at other two snipers, and how crazy that looks. And the thought that they even try to figure out who are they fighting for, and they're not really very direct about it, because a lot of these forces, they don't have a specific type of uniform. It's like everybody's wearing the same uniforms. There's different colors here or there, but it really doesn't help you much. You do see two different flags being flown. The Western forces, it looks like they have 2 stars on the flag, as opposed to whatever's left of the original United States has the more stars, that kind of thing. And one of the scenes that you run into, which is one of the most chilling scenes in this film, comes from the Jesse Plemons scene. And that is, there's a couple of soldiers. It looks like they're fighting for the general regime, who are in the process of burying a whole bunch of bodies. It's a mass grave, and they just run into each other, which results in a couple of other journalists getting murdered. And by the skin of their teeth, the rest of them survive and are rescued. But it's one of the most chilling scenes. You might have seen it in the trailer, in the commercials, where the question of what kind of American are you? And that is definitely, I mean, again, even though you're not told in black and white, it's not spelled out for you who this guy's fighting for and what's his beef. This is a complete, utter racist that you're dealing with. He's shooting people that look and might not have been born in this country, because that's just how he rolls. And that mass grave can probably tell you a little more about what his situation is. And Plemons is a great actor. I remember when I think I first saw him was on Breaking Bad, where they described him as evil Matt Damon. And my God, has that stuck, because he has this very friendly demeanor and face, but he can play completely evil character with that nice face and demeanor. It's incredible. And that's what he kind of does in this film. It's like, he might be okay. And it's like, no, this guy's a psychopath. So they run into him. That's another landmark on the road trip. And then the final set piece, the third act of the film, is actually arriving in Washington, where, unbeknownst to the journalists, the war is practically over. The Northern forces have surrendered. All that's left now is Washington, D.C., and the president, who is bunkered down in the White House. And as all these different forces are just heading up there, so they kind of realize, there's going to be no interview. So they kind of agree that, we just have to be there to witness the aftermath of what is happening, of the final taking down. And One of the things in this film that I noticed, and this is something I don't notice too often, and I'm sure a lot of people don't, is the audio. During the film itself, there was really good audio in terms of the fighting sequences, the guns going off and the machine guns, all the automatic fire. But the third act, which is the attack on Washington, it's at night. The sound in the movie theater was fantastic. And I was able to recreate a little bit of that here at home in my rinky-dink sound system, the 5.1. It is just incredible, the sound. The special effects are wonderful. How they recreate this march on Washington and storming of the White House and the battle inside the White House and all the different things that are going on in terms of trying to get close, trying to take the pictures and try to write the story, and all the way to the end, the reaction even of the president at the end of the film. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's very, very realistic in terms of, that's how he would probably do it if it was in that situation. That's what he would say, and that's what he would probably do. It's a great film. It could not be any more timely. I think it's very brave that it doesn't take a side overtly, like I mentioned earlier, but you can tell what is happening here. I doubt you can take this film and try to make it appealing for both sides. Like, I doubt you can take a right winger and say, oh no, this is about, Biden. This is about the rest of the country coming to get. No. You have to be a complete moron to frame it that way. You have to. The hints are there. Like I said, he didn't want to give them to you on a silver platter. He didn't want to have MAGA hats with the bad guys, and that kind of thing. He didn't want to do that. But the little fragments of information that you get about what the bad guys, whoever the bad guys happen to be, are all about, it's there. They talk about the Antifa massacre. Okay, that's interesting. That can tell you something. Now you could say, well, it could be the one or the other. No, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds, this movie is about the journalists. It's not about the war. It's about how the younger ones get introduced into how this works, and how the older ones are kind of passing the baton, and they're just tired and traumatized and PTSD, all kinds of things that are happening to them because they're different types of person. That's one of the things I listen to when I watch some of the making of documentaries and interviews. They talk about how these individuals, they're like daredevils in terms of they throw themselves into the most chaotic, violent situations just to take a picture. They're not armed. They're not fighting. They're just taking pictures or writing about what's happening and how a lot of them die. A lot of them just get killed. And you hear it every day. You hear from the Ukraine. You hear from Israel, from all these different locations where there's conflicts going on, where all of a sudden you hear, 3 or 4 journalists were just killed in the middle of the war or something. Yeah, this tries to put yourself in that situation and see that this type of a high that they get from the action, from getting the story, getting the picture. But there's no way that you can miss that there's a very thick political message here. There's even a scene where they go through this little town where people don't seem to give a crap about the fact that there's a war happening, and they're trying to live their normal lives and they try to ignore everything around them, which is another excellent message that you also get, which is something that happens here, and that there are people thinking, well, who cares who's president? One or the other, we'll be okay. Everything's be fine. It's like, it's not that simple. You just can't ignore things and hope that things just magically get better. This one is really, really timely, modern one, good one that doesn't just give you the answers. You have to really think about it. And the presentation is fantastic. Like I said, these set pieces, these different acts, these different markers along the way of this road trip are very, very emotional and effective. Great music, too. Absolutely great music. The other thing about this is that there is one character that initially I thought, she looks just too young to be what she is. And she apparently was in her 20s when she made this film. And that's Kaylee Spaney, who has worked with Garland before because she was with Stephen McKinley Henderson in the TV series, I think it was FX or Hulu. I think it was FX. Debs, big crazy sci-fi series. And Nick Offerman, he was in it too. It's like, oh wow, he's kind of gotten the band back together, for a film. And now she is in Alien Romulus. So it's like, oh, that's where she's from. So an up-and-coming actress doing her stuff. But yeah, definitely see this one. This was very strong because, yeah, this could be how it kind of plays itself out. Not an all-out, at least at first, war, but these little pockets of violence where you have one faction or two factions going at it while everybody's trying to figure out what's going on. Don't know if it would ever get to the point where you're dealing with air power, jets, tanks, that kind of thing. But it does give you a taste of, if this is what they want, if this is what you want, this is what you're going to get. Our next film is Good Night and Good Luck. This is directed by George Clooney, and it stars David Strathairn, Patricia Clarkson. George Clooney is also in it as an actor. Jeff Daniels, Robert Downey Jr., Frank Langella. This is an A-level cast that he assembled for this film. This film came out back in 2005, and it was in a way of its time because you got to remember politically what was happening during that time was George Bush era, the Iraq War, all that stuff was taking place. But this specifically has to do with Edward R. Murrow's television show, news commentary show, and how it collided with the McCarthy hearings, the Red Scare, McCarthy era persecutions that were taking place, where he claimed to have all this evidence of all these spies and secret communists within the government, and it completely collapsed on him eventually, figuring out that the majority of it, most of it, was all lies. He just made stuff up because he just wanted, more power. And at one point, when the news media challenged him, and news media meaning Murrow's specific CBS show that he worked for, actually challenged the claims that were being made, McCarthy came after him and started saying a whole bunch of stuff about him that also was complete lies. The movie goes into detail as how at first he was officially threatened not to do this, not to do a story on this guy, because this guy, was I don't know if you could call him an up-and-coming senator, but he was on he was making news for himself. He was becoming somewhat of a personality, if you will, with all these claims. Again, not necessarily producing anything. So at one point, Murrow's group decide to challenge, one of the particular claims against one specific person, somebody who got thrown out of the army or something. And they could not produce the evidence. And again, this is all stemming from McCarthy. So they could not produce the evidence, therefore resulting in that person being reinstated after they had already thrown him out, which is a victory, for news and journalism in general. But at the same time, that's when all the guns start aiming towards him. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. The reason you defended this guy is because you are also a communist and because of your associations with the blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And, you kind of see how governmental power turns on an individual. And all of a sudden it's like they're looking to come up with just about anything they can think of in order to punish that individual. Now, this was happening a little bit. I mean, I'm sure this has been happening for a long time, but as far as we remember it and how it coincides with the release of this film around the Iraq War and the Bush administration, there was a lot of retribution, if you will, which is a more popular word now, taking place where the behind the scenes stories are incredible in terms of news and how it works and how certain forces can influence the news. They can coerce the news. There's so many different ways of manipulating the news. And part of this was already happening back then. Even though they were successful in terms of fighting off McCarthy, there were casualties, if you will, in the process. In the movie, you hear about some couples that they were married who were exposed that they weren't supposed to be married because they were working together in the same company. They were somehow exposed. There was another news anchor who, because of personal problems he was having with his marriage or with his ex-wife, and then culminating with him being then accused of being part of this communist conspiracy, that kind of stuff, he took his own life. So a lot of things like that happened. But the other thing that's happening during the movie that you got to keep in mind, and this is between the conversations between Murrow and Paley, who is the guy running CBS at the time. These are very important names in broadcasting history. Paley is trying to steer Murrow into coloring within the lines and staying unopinionated and just delivering the news, boom, 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 boom. But Murrow makes the case that you can't just say this is one thing and this is another thing when something is completely not true. You can't just ignore it. You have to report it as it being untrue. But with Paley, the other thing that's happening at the same time is how not only is it an issue of false equivalences, which is what we deal with nowadays a lot, but it's also the corporate ownership and the corporate takeover of all these media sources. So, for example, in a time when the news was considered to be an untouchable part of broadcasting, where they did not have to bow down to sponsors and that sort of thing. I mean, they took on sponsors, obviously. They were sponsored by blah, 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 and so and this and the other. But there was always this line where the news is the news. You cannot manipulate the news. But this is a period where you could kind of say this is where it kind of started, or this is when it kind of started to shift off balance, where the corporate interests were starting to become more important in terms of revenue versus just putting together the news. And this is one of the things that happens towards the end of the film, which is when, even though they resolve their situation with McCarthy, their show is basically shut down, and allegedly because of sponsors. The money that is needed to keep the show going, people are watching game shows and stuff like that. They're cheaper to produce, so they have to start cutting back on things like news. So that is a very interesting dual kind of message that you get with this film. Historically, this is also the beginning of the Walter Cronkite era, which is also considered to be, Murrow, Cronkite, those are the pillars of journalism. But it seems as if it kind of began around that time. Now, the connection to what is happening now with this film, it goes kind of two ways. One of them is, yes, we're talking about the 50s here, okay? So you fast forward, oh my God, 70 years later, my God, I can't believe 70 years later, and you are now in our time. And the relationship between the corporate owners of all of these media outlets, it's incredible, how worse it's gotten in terms of everything is entertainment. Everything is entertainment. Everything is stockholders. Everything is profit. I mean, you can kind of say, yes, it's always been that way. It has, but at least with the news, it used to be a little more hands off. But now the news is a commodity, just like any television show you can think of. If you don't produce the numbers, you're out. If you don't get the ratings, you're out. Not only that, but to this point, there's always been manipulation of the news in terms of political situations or political parties or political figures trying to influence the news. And we've gotten to a point now where, for example, like the latest and greatest story here is the fact that the Washington Post and I think the LA Times or something like that, they decided that this year they will not endorse a political candidate. Now, how important is a political endorsement from a newspaper? Probably not much, but it's something you kind of hang on your resume in terms of, hey, look, listen, even these newspapers who are all about the news, they're endorsing me or not endorsing this person. But the fact that they decide to do it this year is something that's very coincidental. And that is something that, because they're hedging their bets in terms of which way the election goes, and they want to be able to play ball, if you will, with whoever wins. Now, again, this election is not a normal election. You're not dealing with two sides of the coin. No, you're not. Again, going back to the false equivalencies. Nope, we're not dealing with false equivalencies here. We are dealing with we're dealing with moderate versus extreme right. And what's happening is that these newspapers, these news outlets, from their corporate owners, not so much from their writers, but their corporate owners, have decided that if the election goes one way or the election goes the other way, they want to be in good graces with the other person. In this case, for example, Trump, who has been screaming about for years that he's going to go after all of these people that don't like him. He's going to go after all of them. He's going to go after all of them. He wants to, coincidentally, he decided that he wants to pull the license from CBS News because he's so unhappy with the way that they conducted their interviews. Forget the fact that that's not how it works. But the fact that that sentiment, that threat that has been issued so many times for so many different outlets, it gives you the impression that these companies are being swayed. They're being convinced to, hey, well, listen, if I'm not going to endorse you, at least I won't endorse the other one just to make you happy, just so you won't be so angry at me. That's what they seem to be doing. But again, it's news. You cannot be completely impartial when it comes to news because you cannot make a horrific situation just the other side of the story. No, you can't, it's just not being impartial. When you see something bad happening, you have to report it as bad happening. If they have buildings on fire, you can't just say, allegedly this building has been warming. The thing is in flames, but you can't say it's a fire because you're being too one-sided by saying it's a fire. It is what it is. And that's one of the things that in this film, Murrow was fighting against. They tried to keep him from being objective, but he says that there's certain stories that need objectivity because it's clearly what is happening in front of you and you can't ignore it. You can't just say the other side of the story is this. The other point that brings us back to today with this particular movie is that when McCarthy was on the ropes in terms of when he then started getting investigated, when things turned around and everything kind of crumbled around him, when all of these accusations were falling apart because he had no proof of anything, his lawyer was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, if you do the research, you'll realize that Roy Cohn was Trump's mentor. He is the guy that taught Trump all of the dirty, scheming stuff since the 70s. He is his guru, if you will. He's his Karl Rove. He is his dirty trickster in terms of what he's done for him. The movie that came out recently, The Apprentice, which I wanted to try to watch before this. I might get a chance. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's all about the relationship between him and Roy Cohn and how influential that person was in teaching him that whole thing about deny everything. The bigger the lie, the better. Roy Cohn's background goes back to, working with mobsters and working with all kinds of shady figures throughout politics and, social times. But that is such a huge coincidence that there is a very direct connection between these political events and the current election. For our final film, we have Antebellum. This is a film that I did a full-blown review when I first saw it a couple years ago. So feel free to go and take a look at that. But because it's I guess you can call it a horror film, a horror thriller. This was directed by Gerard Bush and Christopher Renz. It's a little bit of a kind of a Twilight Zone episode in a way. And it's about a woman who is a very successful woman, a black woman, and she's going on this book tour to promote one of her new books that's coming out. And at the same time, we're also watching the story of a plantation and the crazy things that are going on in the plantation. So it's, you're dealing with the South, the Civil War South, if you will, or the pre-Civil War South. And I can't really tell you too much about the connection between the two because it would give away it would spoil the twist that you're dealing with. But what I can tell you is that during the Civil War part of the film, you do get a couple of callbacks to modern times. Specifically, you get to hear some of the Charlottesville's chants that happened back when Trump was in office a couple years ago, having to do with the protesters with the tiki torches and the white supremacists chanting about the Jews will not replace us and all that other crap that was being spewed, that then Trump seemed to be protecting that event, seemed to be making up excuses for that event. This is the good people on both sides incident, if you will. Well, what's really interesting about this film is that it gives you a peek into some of the more modern ways that the leftover Civil War results, if you will, still seem to permeate during these modern times. The idea that you could kind of recreate that somehow, and that you're still in that mindset, and that you see people arguing and tippy-toeing and dog whistling so much on television. I'm talking about senators, representatives, people that are like sort of important politically, going out on a limb. Now, granted, yes, we mentioned this many times before. Ever since 2016, there are a lot of norms that have been completely bypassed, where it's like people just say whatever they want, no matter how important they are. The reverence and manners are kind of out the window. We are definitely living in an idiocracy environment. The picture of President Camacho, which seemed ridiculous at the time, then we got the feel of it. I mean, this rally that just took place in Madison Square Garden, even with Hulk Hogan, out of all people in the world, who was at the RNC convention, kind of doing a Camacho presentation in a way. It just blows your mind that we've gotten to that point, that it's no longer a joke. But with this movie, out of all of the ones we talked about, I think it's the best one that gives you the message of how these people are there. They exist. They're hiding. They're not hiding. Depending on where you live, they're still hoping for a change. I mean, I live in Florida. I drive to work every day, and I drive by this trailer home with the Confederate flag out in the front, and out and proud. They're out and proud. It's incredible. But the idea that there are people in power who are still hoping and wishing that things would change. Well, with this movie, and again, under the guise of horror and thriller, it gives you the opportunity to see that. How would it work? How could it work? How could it happen in this particular manner? And I know I'm tippy-toeing around the edges here of exactly the spoiler parts of the film. And like I said, if you're really, really interested, go back and dig up my review for this movie, because it's very full of all kinds of spoilers. But I absolutely love this movie. This is a great movie because it kept you trying to figure out what exactly is happening here. And it throws in the political aspects of, you know, when you watch a movie having to do with the past, you're like, well, that's the mindset of the past. But then when you watch a movie like this one, where it introduces the present, you're like, well, how do you tie those two together? How do you make that connection between the past and the present? How does the mindset just transfer from one to the other? It's funny because when I saw the trailer for this movie, I thought it was more of a supernatural kind of thing that was happening. But then when you see it, and again, in a typical Twilight Zone manner, they went for even though Twilight Zone does a lot of supernatural sci-fi stuff, they went for a very straight, plausible, if you will, you could say plausible, twist. And this is a great one. I wish these two would have done some other movies, because I haven't seen anything new from them. This movie came out like 4 years ago. But I would definitely add it, because there is a feel, especially once when you're a northerner and you then all of a sudden live in the South, that adjustment and that manner in which you have to kind of start seeing things a little different and being careful about certain things and watching certain things, it's there. You could see it in this film, the adjustment, and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. You got to be careful with this. You got to be careful with that. But I definitely think that this is a very good movie to watch, again, when it comes to election time, because this is part of the thinking and part of the people that are being courted and targeted, groups that normally would never come out and participate in elections, and they really were kind of marginalized because in the past, I'm talking about pre-social media and that sort of thing, a lot of these fringe groups would kind of stay in the background. They kind of stay way, way in the background, and they would be upset because their particular parties were not racist enough. You had dog whistles, but dog whistles take you so far. But what's happened now is the dog whistle is, it's like a fire hose now. It's just a slush, a tidal wave of hate that they're like, oh yeah. And as we get to the last days of the election, the last week of the election, and I'm definitely trying to get this show out before we get to there, for the last 8 years or so, these groups are in the forefront. They are a voting bloc, and Trump is doubling down on the hate and the racism and trying to carve out whatever little niches of these type of groups are still out there. Traditionally, politicians, they try to go for the undecideds, the people in the middle, the people that are not sure which way to go during the end. Trump is doing the opposite. He's going for the extreme right, the more extreme right, the crazier and wackier they are. That's who he's trying to carve out a notch and trying to bring those people out to vote for him, as demonstrated, obviously, by some of the things that are being said this week. The practically Nazi rally he had at Madison Square Garden, all the hate that was spewed there on his behalf. And now he's trying to backtrack some of those comments, but not fully, because he can't, because he needs those ugly comments. He needs them to keep his base happy. But at the same time, it's kind of like, I wish they hadn't said that, but I really don't have a problem with what they said. It's like one of those stupid things he always does. Anyway, strongly recommend all these films. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed today's show. As promised, I wanted to tell you the movies that we went over back during the last two elections. Back when it was 2016, we had Do the Right Thing, Network, Idiocracy, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, A Face in the Crowd, and Bob Roberts. I cannot recommend A Face in the Crowd so much more than I already do. That movie is so relevant back in 2016 and then in 2020, and once again, it's super relevant today. Then in 2020, we had All the President's Men, The Manchurian Candidate, The Handmaid's Tale, The Birth of a Nation, Jonestown, The Life and Death of People's Temple, and Judgment at Nuremberg. And today, we added to our list Joe, Antebellum, Nazi Town, USA, Civil War, Zone of Interest, and Good Night and Good Luck. That is a nice chunk of movies that hopefully some of you might have a chance to go over. Obviously, you're not going to have enough time to really watch all these films before the election, because I'm putting out a show the weekend of the election, so you got about a day or two to cram some of these if you're interested. They're great movies nonetheless. I mean, aside from them being very relevant politically with what's happening today, they are just great films across the board. So thanks everybody for listening, and I promise you we'll get back to non-political shows next time. So we'll see you here soon at GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Increasing numbers, the nation's youth has been going away to camp.
In the 1930s, there were these camps all across the country, and they looked normal. But it wasn't normal. It was Nazi camp.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the depths of the Depression, a great many Americans started to ask themselves whether the American experiment was failing.
Lots of Americans thought that capitalism, democracy, they were done for, and something else was going to have to take its place.
The membership card in the Friends of the New Germany. Note the American emblem, and over it the Nazi swastika.
As foreign as this might seem, fascist ideology tapped into some dark realities in America.
I'd like to tell you a few words about our purpose and aims.
He imagined that he was going to build a distinctively American version of Nazism. are after power, are after influence within the very fabric of the United States.
They were literally holding parades in front of Jewish people's homes. There's no such thing as foreign fascism. Fascism is always homegrown.
If you would like to subscribe to our show, send us messages, or see video links to some of the topics we talked about today, please visit our homepage at geekfestrants.com or our YouTube channel, Facebook page, or iTunes at GeekFest Rants.
I don't know what we're yelling about!
GeekFest Rants is produced by Carlos Perron, copyright 2024.
This broadcast is part of the IC Robots Radio Network. Visit icrobots.com for this and many other nerd/nostalgia related podcasts. You won't be sorry for long.